In this video, we will learn about constructors and destructors in C++ object-oriented programming by building a bank account system. So let's start by saying class and naming it bank account like this, okay? And what I will do is I'll define two private data members. So I'll say private like this, and I'll say string account holder for the account name. It will store the account owner name, and int balance, which will be the balance of the account. Now I will say something like public right here to define the public functions that we will use. Now what's the difference between private and public? Well, you can check out this video about where I explain about private and public as well as encapsulation. But simply private means that you set members as private. That means they are only accessible within the class they are created in. But when you set something to public, that means this member can be accessed within the class as well as outside the class. So inside the main it could be accessed. Now, what is encapsulation? It is when you set these data members to private. So right here, what I'm doing is I'm encapsulating these data members or hiding these data members, okay? Now let's go down here and define some getters and setter methods or functions. Now, when you have data members that set are as private, you need to have a getter function that simply returns that data member and a setter function that simply modifies this data member. And now let me go ahead and create these getters and setter functions, and I'll speed the process up because they're very simple to do. Alright, these are the getter functions that simply return a data member. As you can see here, there is a return keyword followed by the data member, and there is the setter function that simply takes a parameter and modifies a certain data member. Very simple to do, okay? Now let's start by learning about constructors. So what is a constructor function? A constructor function is simply a function that doesn't have a return type, has the same name of the class, and as well as it is called automatically as soon as you create an object. Let's go ahead and see a constructor function. So I'll say bank account like this, and this right here is a constructor function. Let me just give it a simple cout message like hello world, and I'll explain it now. So a constructor function doesn't have a return type, has the same name of the class right here, and it is called automatically as soon as you create an object. So let me go ahead and prove it to you. So I'll go down here and create an object by saying bank account. So this will be the type of the object, and I'll say something like my account like this, or for example account like this, okay? Now let me go ahead and launch the code, and you will see that the constructor function will be called automatically, and let's go ahead and see it. As you can see, we got hello world. We can go down here and you can see that I didn't use the object to call the function, to call the constructor function. So that proves that the constructor function is actually called automatically as soon as you create an object. So always keep this in mind. A constructor function doesn't have a return type, has the same name of the class right here, and it's called automatically as soon as you create an object. But why does a constructor function called automatically? What's the purpose of this? Well, basically constructors are used to initialize these data members, the data members of the class. So let's go ahead and see it. How could a constructor initialize these data members? Well, a constructor is in the end a simple function. It could receive parameters. So I could give this constructor parameters like string account owner name, for example. This will be the account owner name or the input, okay? And so now I could go ahead and give it something else like int balance or account balance like this. So I could give the constructor inputs or parameters to receive. But now when I give it parameters to receive, down here when I create the object, I need to give these arguments or give this input for the constructor. And how to do this? It's very simple. Just put those parentheses after the object and give the following inputs for the constructor and make sure they are in order. So let's start by the account owner name. Let's say John Smith like this. And for the balance, let's say $150, for example, okay? So John Smith will deposit $150. Now, when we receive these inputs, we need to make sure that we add them inside those data members. So how to do this? Well, it's very simple. Once we receive these values, I'll say account holder, this is the data member, and I will set it equal to account owner name, which is the parameter. So the input given by the user will be stored inside this data member, okay? And now what we could do also with constructors is that we could validate the input given. So right here I have account balance. There is a possibility that the user might give me, for example, -1. This is invalid, right? What I could do is I could simply validate the input by simply using an if statement like this. So what I will do is I'll say something like if balance, for example, is greater than 0. So as long as it is greater than 0, that means it is a valid number. So I'll say balance equal to account balance like this, okay? So what I'm doing, I'm setting or assigning this input to the data member. Otherwise, if this is not the case, I'll simply give it a default value of $5, for example. Okay, so this right here is a constructor function. What will happen is that this is a constructor function. It's called automatically. It receives these two inputs given here when you create an object. Let me put this 150. So it is given when you create an object. These inputs will be stored in these data members. Okay, and so a constructor is used to initialize data members. Let me prove it to you. So I'll go ahead and say something like cout account dot, and when you use the dot notation, you can access the functions inside the class. So I'll say get account holder name, for example. I'll say and L right here, and I'll say cout account like this dot get balance. Let's see if the constructor actually works. So what I'm going to do right now is compile and then launch my file like this. As you can see, the constructor actually works. Now let me talk about overloaded constructors. Well, you know that a constructor is simply a function, right? And we know that we can overload functions, meaning we can have the same function that has the same name but different return type or parameters. But here, because we're talking about constructors, we can have another constructor with the same name, but you can have different parameters. Right now, I'm going to create an empty constructor, meaning without parameters. This works properly. So what I'm doing now is I'm overloading the constructor, okay? Now watch this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set account holder equal to unknown like this, and I'll say balance equal to $1. So for example, if the user didn't give me any inputs right here, this actually works. Why? Because now we have an overloaded constructor. We have another constructor that can handle this situation. So if I gave input right here, the compiler will actually know which constructor it will use. So if the compiler notice that there's inputs given right here, that means it should use this constructor. But because down here we didn't give any input, so the compiler will know that this constructor must be used. Let me prove it to you. So I'm going to launch my file to see what we will get. So compile and then launch. As you can see, we got unknown and 1. So the overloaded constructor works properly. Now let's go ahead and learn about destructor. This function is called whenever the object is not used. So like in the end of the code, the destructor will be called automatically. Let me show it to you. First of all, to define a destructor, you need to use this symbol right here. And then you give the same name of the class. So bank account like this. Right now, this is your destructor. Let me go ahead and give it something like object killed, for example. So let me go ahead and show it to you. After right here, I'm not going to call the destructor because a destructor is also called automatically as soon as the object is not being used. So at the end of your code, your object won't be used anymore, right? Let's go ahead and see it. I will go and launch my code like this and compile and launch. As you can see, unknown, 1, and then object killed. So at the end of your code, your destructor will be called by your compiler. What it will do is that the compiler will call the destructor, and the destructor is used to kill the object to be able to free up space in memory. And of course, by default, the the compiler will create for you a default constructor if you don't mention a destructor yourself. So basically, there is no need for you to mention a destructor in your classes because the compiler will create a default constructor. But as a C++ developer, you must know about destructors. And now let's continue with this bank account class. Let's add a few more methods or functions, like void deposit. So we need to allow the user to deposit an amount. So int amount like this. And first of all, I need to check if this amount is valid. So I'll say if amount greater than 0, so as long as this amount is valid, what I will do is I'll say balance plus equal to amount. So I will add this balance, I'll add this amount to the balance. Otherwise, if the balance, if the amount is not valid, what I'll do is I'll simply print a message. So failed to deposit like this. Okay, simple. Now let's do a withdraw. So I want to allow the user to take off money from their account. So withdraw like this, and I'll say int amount. Right here we have two conditions. I'll say if the amount given by the user is greater than 0, okay, and if the amount is less than or equal to the balance. So maybe the user gave me -1. This is invalid, right? Or maybe the user gave me, for example, they have a balance of 150. Let me add right here. So maybe their balance was 150 and they gave me 160. that is wrong. They cannot withdraw 160 because they don't already have 160, right? So what I'm going to do here is that if this condition is valid, I'll say balance minus equal to amount. Otherwise, I'll say cout failed to withdraw, like this. Okay, now let's go ahead and test these functions out. After this, I'll say something like account.deposit, like this, and I'll say something like, let's deposit $300. Okay, and now let me go ahead and copy this, paste it right here to see the before and after. And now let me go ahead and say something like account.withdraw, like this, and I'll say minus, or excuse me, 120. Okay, so I want to withdraw $120. And let me go ahead and print this again. So as you can see, after launching my file, we have John Smith, $150. After adding 120, it will become, did I add 120? I added $300, excuse me. So after adding $300, this will be our amount. And then I take off from the amount, or my balance, I took off 120. This is our balance. And at the end, the constructor, excuse me, the destructor will be called and the object will be killed to free up space in our memory. Alright, this is it for constructors and destructors in C++ object-oriented programming. Make sure to subscribe to stay up to date for the next C++ video. And I hope to see you in the next one.